All right, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Espino Perez, and this is General Psychology. So today we're going to talk about the expectations for this course, and then we will move into a little bit of introductory information about psychology as a science. So you all should have received an email this weekend, if not a week before. I sent out an email about a week before telling you about this book. But the book we will be using is Psychology Contemporary Perspectives by Paulo Kami. It was published in 2013, so it should be readily available on Amazon, and you may be able to find a free PDF online. I don't know, maybe try Googling. I do not endorse that, but if you need a free textbook while you're waiting for your textbook to arrive, it might be a good idea. All right, so let's talk about this course. So, for those of you who've taken courses with me, you might want to fast forward through this because I usually do the same intro for the courses that I teach. So I'll tell you a little bit about who I am, then we'll get into some class policies, and then we'll talk a little bit about the introduction to this class. So what is science and what does psychology have to do with science? All right, so my name is Dr. Kathy Espino Perez. You can call me Dr. EP, Dr. Espino Perez, but not just Dr. Perez or Dr. Espino. It's both names, so Dr. Espino Perez, Dr. EP, etc. So don't hate me, but I'm actually not from Oregon. I was born and raised in North Hollywood, California, which is about 20-minute drive from Hollywood. Yeah. And I went to Cal State Northridge for my undergrad and my master's. So this is my university. It's a state school, sort of like Western Oregon is. We were the Matadors, whereas here we are the Wolves. And this is me while I was getting my master's degree. All right, so in general psychology, we're going to be discussing a large variety of different types of psychology, or different types of topics that you can study within psychology. And my level of expertise is within social psychology. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is. So generally, social psychology is the study of the real, imagined, or implied presence of others and how that affects your affect, behavior, and cognition. So what that means is I study how other people's presence, whether it's real, imagined, or implied, affects people's perceptions of prejudice, discrimination, stigma, etc. So when I was in high school, I went to a pretty segregated high school, even though I didn't think that when I was in high school. So most of the students that went to my high school were Latino, first gen, very low income. Some of my friends were DACA students before there was DACA, but like undocumented students. So that was my reality, right? And I think for some of you, that might have been your reality, where you went to high school with students that looked very much like you or socioeconomically like you. And when I was admitted to college, I was admitted to a lot of different colleges, as I'm sure you all were. And I decided to go to a private liberal arts college in Minnesota because they gave me the best financial aid package. But while I was there, I was one of the few people of color in the classroom. I was probably the only Latina. The other person of color usually was a Black student or an Asian student. And I found that a lot of my white peers had very limited contact with Latinos, especially Latinos that were around their age and that went to college. So I experienced a lot of evaluations based solely on my race or the stereotypes associated with my race and ethnicity, not necessarily my actual abilities. So that really led me to doubt myself and to consider dropping out of college. So I actually almost dropped out of college, but I didn't, right? Because I'm here right now. So I almost dropped out of college, but I went back home to California from Minnesota, and I decided to transfer to Cal State Northridge, where I started studying social psychology, and I learned about stereotype threat, which is the fear of confirming a negative stereotype, and this usually happens to people who have negative stereotypes about them, right? So like women have the negative stereotype of being poor performers in math tasks. Minorities generally, black, black or African American and Latinx or Latino people are stereotyped to be really poor at academics, right? So I had the fear of confirming the negative stereotype of being bad at academics, which inadvertently leads you to confirm the stereotype. Because you're so worried about confirming that stereotype that it actually decreases your attention to disconfirming the stereotype. So then you actually confirm the stereotype. So I didn't do really well my first year at Carleton, but after that I did pretty well. So if you're thinking about dropping out, or if you have in the past, totally normal. I did, and now I am here, right? So I finished undergrad, master's, and a PhD. So woo, I'm here, so don't give up. All right, so now I'm interested in a few different things, and this is the end of my first year teaching. And so what is my current work? So my current work focuses on like 3 different lenses, right? So one, I explore how people's multiple social identities might affect their belonging in college. So all of us have multiple social identities, right? So for me, I'm a professor, I am a researcher, I am a daughter, I'm an aunt, I'm a runner, or I was. I'm trying to get back into it. I like doing yoga, I'm a cycler. So we all have those multiple social identities, but I'm wondering if there are different identities that might influence your belonging in college or not. I'm also interested in my second line of work, which is this picture. I'm also interested in how people perceive, racially categorize, and respond to people who are biracial. So biracial individuals are one of the largest growing populations in the United States. But for biracial people, they might not be accepted by either the majority group that they belong to or the minority group that they belong to. So in a set of studies that I'm working on publishing right now, I find that for a biracial Latino white individual, they're rejected by monoracial Latinos. So monoracial Latinos evaluate them as being more white relative to Latino, but white people, on the other hand, view this monoracial Latino white person, biracial Latino white person, and they evaluate them as being more Latino relative to white. So it's these people that are sort of stuck in between. They're not accepted by either group. So I'm interested in how that might change depending on the situation. So the situation in which they were evaluated in my study was a diversity scholarship. But maybe with everything that's going on right now when it comes to race relations and things like that, people of minority groups might be more willing to accept biracial individuals in their group. So this is Get Out, and if you haven't seen it already, you should. It's a great movie. But essentially, it's about this black man who goes and visits his white girlfriend's family, and they're overly nice. Like the white father pats him on the back, like how like you do with your bros. And he tells him that if he could have, he would have voted for Obama 3 times. So very liberal, white, positive attitudes towards black people, right? But what ends up happening is some really awful stuff, right? So they were only pretending to be nice because they wanted something from him. I won't spoil it in case you haven't watched it. And that's essentially what I study. So I study how racial and ethnic minorities perceive positive feedback from whites. So when white people act in a positive way towards racial and ethnic minorities, is it because they're being genuine, or is it because you're scared of being labeled a racist? And I feel like that has a lot of relevance, especially right now, given that there's a lot of attention being placed on interracial contact right now. So whites seem to be anxious about being viewed as racist. So a lot of them could be behaving positively, and I think racial and ethnic minorities are having a moment where they are putting whites' behavior sort of under the microscope, right? They're canceling people left and right, etc. Okay, so that's what I study. I'm looking for research assistants. I currently have 2. With coronavirus, it's kind of hard to know whether the data we collect will be good, but I am interested in collecting some data on this, and I'm also running other research studies that may be of interest to you. So if you're interested, shoot me an email. Maybe we can talk at the end of the course. All right. So I've talked for about 10 minutes about myself. Woo. So I also want to get to know you, right? So I don't just want you to know me. I want to get to know you. So for the first forum that you'll find on our website, I want you to share your name, your year in school, what you hope to learn from this class, and why you're taking this class over the summer, right? So I didn't take this class over the summer. I think I took it during the term when I was an undergrad, but I'm hoping that I provide you with a great learning experience this summer, and I'll try. And I will give you a good learning experience. All right, so let's talk about this class. So when you walk away from this class, what do I want you to know? So one, I want you to cultivate a general knowledge of the theories and current findings of psychological science. So I want you to be able to talk about what kind of work we do as psychological scientists. I want you to understand the methods underlying psychological research. So how do we answer our questions? How do we assess people's personalities, for example? How do we recruit participants? How do we analyze our data, etc.? And I think this is an important core, especially if you're a psych major, to understand and to move forward in your future classes. I also hope that you understand how basic theory and experimental findings are informed by and or apply to everyday situations. So you'll find that a lot of the very intriguing discoveries in psychological science are either motivated by people's just people's everyday observations, right? So we might observe something and say, I wonder if that is true for everyone. So we conduct a study and we find that it is or is not true, or it's confined to certain boundary conditions. But another aspect of psychological science is that even though it might be very basic work, and we'll talk about what basic means, meaning it only happens in the lab, we often find that sometimes those findings are externally validated by their presence in our real lives. So we're going to understand how experimental findings are informed by and or inform our personal lives. All right, so we talked about the textbook. So the textbook is going to be Psychology, Contemporary Perspectives by Paul Okami. So you can check that out. Again, I don't encourage this, but I know that some students like to Google PDF free versions of the text, and I don't encourage it, but I've heard some students were successful at it. So how am I going to grade you in this class? So it's a 6-week class, right? So it's going to be jam-packed. I've modeled my class after some of my colleagues' classes, so I decided that I'm going to have mini lectures Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we're going to go over a lot of different topics. So, all right, so for the syllabus, I want you to read through it just because I always have students asking me about my office hours or how they sign up for office hours and when the assignments are due, etc., even though all that information is in the syllabus. So to reward you for reading the syllabus, I will put up a syllabus quiz that will be due this Sunday. It will be worth 5 points, which is 3% of your grade. We will also have different forums. So there will be 10 forums available to you. One is starting this week, and it's basically for you to answer questions about yourself. So your name, you're in school, I'll put that up. Then I will also have reading checks sporadically throughout the term, and that will be worth 18% of your grade. Then we will have 3 exams. So exam 1, exam 2, and exam 3 are worth 24% each. And here is the breakdown of the class. So to get an A, A minus, B, etc. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, say, okay, Monday at noon, I'm going to do the lecture, and then I'm going to do the assignment. So make sure you keep to a schedule. Read the assigned readings. Repeatedly practice the material and practice it frequently outside of class. Take good notes by hand. This is one of the most important predictors of success. And review your notes before each class. And let me know if you have any questions. Also post your questions to the Help Me forum. And keep track of how you're doing. So on Moodle, I have the grades accessible to you, so you can keep track of how you're doing throughout the term. And I also posted the ranges of scores that will correspond to different letter grades. So I would encourage you to look at that. All right, so I encourage you to post questions, and now we're going to move on to some lecture material. We only have about 8 slides left, and then we're going to go over the rest during next lecture, which will be on Wednesday. Okay, so what is psychology? Psychology is the marriage between these two words in Latin. So psyche means soul and spirit, soul or spirit, and logia means study or knowledge. Psychology is also the scientific study of mind and behavior. So the mind processes different events and behavior. So things that happen in the mind usually aren't readily observable. So you could be thinking a million different things, but I probably can't guess what you're thinking. But we also study behavior, so all potentially observable or measurable activities. So if I am interested in seeing how often you run, I can actually see that. So this is often referred to as psychological science. So when we are talking about psychology, when we're talking about psychologists, we're talking about people who are involved in psychological science. So this is interesting because often when you think of science fields, what do you think of? For most people, that wouldn't include psychology. So this would include more STEMmy fields like biology and chemistry. But you'd be surprised to learn that some institutions like the NIH, for example, might include, or the NHLBI, the National Heart and Lung Blood Institute, might classify psychology as within those science, technology, and engineering fields. So how do we distinguish the way that people study the field of psychology, right? So the way that we distinguish them is in 3 ways. We might distinguish them by employment setting. So do they teach at a college or other places? When I was an undergrad, I thought psychologists were just people who provide therapy to others, so clinical psychologists, and I thought that's what I wanted to be. But then when I heard, oh, you can do research as a psychologist, I'm like, okay, I think I'd like that better. We also distinguish psychologists in their field of study. So psychology is a really broad umbrella under which different fields of study exist. And we also distinguish psychology by the perspective that we follow. And we'll distinguish between that in the next few slides. All right, so we can talk about the employment setting. So the employment setting, most people that are psychologists think end up being in either academic psychology or applied psychology. So when we talk about academic psychology, we're talking about people like me. So we conduct basic research, which means we conduct research and teaching for the purpose of advancing knowledge. So I'm here teaching this class. I also conduct research. So I'm an academic psychologist. I'm a professor. For applied psychologists, they conduct research to help solve problems of the individual, society, or industry. And these kind of people they might graduate with a PhD or a master's degree in psychology, and they might work for the New York Times, the New Yorker, Facebook, Google, eHarmony, Tinder, all sorts of things. So there are a lot of different companies. Zillow. So I just saw an ad for a job at Zillow. These organizations are seeking out the research methods of psychology to be able to study people and to see how their products are perceived by people. And both academic and applied psychology may be conducted in a number of different settings. So I talked about academic psychology being like a professor, being at a college, but you might be at a think tank. You might work for the government, for example. And there are different fields of study, so I'm only going to go through a few. Your textbook goes through a few more. So there's developmental psychologists. So these individuals study the various ways that humans beings change or remain stable across the lifespan. So I did a postdoc, even though I'm a social psychologist, I did a postdoc with a developmental psychologist. So I examined how prejudice and discrimination occurs or impacts racial and ethnic minorities in middle school and high school. And usually I'm only focusing on adult samples. So I think it's an interesting perspective to examine how stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination might affect people across the lifespan. There's also cognitive psychologists, and they study aspects of human cognition. And cognition is information processing function of the mind. They also focus on perception, language, memory, and consciousness, for example. So these people might examine why stereotypes exist, how they perpetuate themselves in the mind, what kinds of connections people make between different racial and ethnic minority groups and their stereotypes. Then there are also clinical and counseling psychologists, and these are the type of people that usually, or the career that people think of when you talk about psychologists. So these individuals study and or treat mental health and other problems, and they represent about half of all psychologists currently employed. So this is a huge portion of the psychology workforce, but there are other kinds of psychologists that are employed currently too. So hopefully that has shed some light on not all psychologists can treat mental health problems, but there are other aspects of psychology that can be helpful to people. All right, so within those realms, there could be different perspectives, right? So I'm a social psychologist, sorry, I hit the mic. I'm a social psychologist, and I've done work within the biobehavioral perspective. So here, the key is understanding human behavior and how it lies in understanding the human brain and body. So for my dissertation, we collected data from first-generation low-income Latino students, and we examined their cortisol level, which is a stress hormone. So I was examining prejudice, discrimination, and stigma from a biobehavioral perspective. You could also be a developmental psychologist and examine the cognitive perspective. And this is when you examine the information processing aspect of the brain. So for me, this would be examining middle and high school students' beliefs about stereotypes. So, and how that changes across the lifespan. There's also the evolutionary perspective, and this perspective argues that the human brain and mind evolved in very specific ways to help our ancestors solve the sorts of problems they experienced over evolutionary time. There's also positive psychology. This is where you use psychological science to study human strengths and positive attributes. We have the psychodynamic perspective, where human beings are strongly affected by unconscious conflicts and motivations that may be expressed in their behavior and personality. Then finally, we have the sociocultural perspective, which emphasizes the role played by society and culture in shaping human psychology. Great. All right, but where did psychology come from? So there are different schools of early psychological science. So first we had structuralists, and they studied the content of the mind. So they studied the content of the mind in a scientific manner. Some examples of this include Edward Titchener, who introduced something called introspection, looking within to study the mind in a scientific manner. So introspection is sort of what like Descartes talked about. He said, I think, therefore I am. He would be considered a structuralist. Then we have a functionalist. These individuals studied the function of the mind, or how evolution shapes the development of the mind. The psychologist that is most associated with this perspective is William James. Then we had psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud. They argued that human beings are driven by conflicts and desires that may lie partially or entirely hidden below the level of conscious awareness. So we have to analyze those thoughts below conscious awareness to understand people's psychological well-being. Then we have behaviorists who believed that only observable behavior could and should be studied scientifically. And finally, we had humanists that emphasize individuals' dignity, worth, and free will. And people like this would be Carl Rogers and Maslow. And for behaviorists, we would have Pavlov. So only behavior can be studied scientifically. So Pavlov's dogs, and we'll talk about that. And modern psychological science was born as a union between philosophy and biology. So we're focusing on thought processes, we're focusing on biological processes, we're talking about whether the brain and body are united. So Descartes believes that the brain and the body, or the mind, were not united, didn't work together, so it was considered a dualist. But evidence since then has shown that the brain and the body are linked. So we can talk about that more later. But one way in which they're linked, for example, is if you experience large amounts of stress, whether it be from coronavirus, from taking online classes, from being a single parent, from working many jobs, from living in poverty, that psychological phenomenon of stress affects your body in very different ways. So this is part of the reason why psychology is very important to study. All right, so just to give you some food for thought, I want you to think about whether psychological science is really scientific. So I asked you earlier whether you thought that when you talk about STEM fields, whether you think of psychology. Most people don't. I talked about psychology being a psychological science. So think about what makes a science, right? So who gets to decide what field of study is scientific? So think about what makes a science and whether psychological science falls under that umbrella. All right, great. So let me know if you have any questions. I will be posting the forum shortly. And great, first class. So let me just close out of here.